Alright, so this time we're going to talk about the effect of a tariff in a large country. And just to remind you, a small country is a country that doesn't affect world prices. So if we're talking about an importer, that means that a small country faces a horizontal export supply curve, so that if they want to buy the good, they have to pay the world price and they don't have any choice. So here's my world price for the small country. And if this country imposes a tariff, then the foreign suppliers simply pass the full amount of the tariff on to the consumers in the small country. Let's see what's different about a large country. So the small country is going to be an importer, so they supply the import demand curve in this diagram, but the export supply curve comes from another country that we've not been particularly specific about, but they have an export supply curve that slopes upwards. And what that means is that this country, so we have this is the autarky price, then this country, the importer, must be so large that they are able to influence the price at which they trade on world markets. So here's this country's import demand curve that starts at the autarky equilibrium price for the import country. We have an export supply curve. Let's see what the world equilibrium is, which we can find in the world market. It's about there. So I don't know any. So let's just draw the world equilibrium. You can see we have equilibrium that is established at this particular point, and then we have an equilibrium quantity of exports and imports traded. We have a world price, and when we take that price over to the small country, you can see that at that world price, the desire to import exceeds the the desire to purchase this good exceeds the production in the domestic industry. So we have, say, Q4 demanded and Q1 supplied, and so then the gap, of course, is imports. And then the question is, well, what happens if we impose a tariff? So let's put a tariff on, and we'll say that the size of the tariff is just T. It's some dollar amount. We say in economics that tariffs drive a wedge between supply and demand price. So let's say this is the price the consumer pays. It will be equal to PS plus the tariff. The government wants to take its cut. So we have a couple more things to define. So PC is the consumer's price. And PS is the producer's price, the supplier's price. And there has to be a gap, because that's the amount that the government is going to take. If you imposed a tariff in this small country up in the top left corner, you can see that what happens essentially is that the supplier's price is fixed at PW. The entire tariff is passed on to the consumers in the import country that's imposed the tariff. In this case, and this should be familiar to you if you studied the incidence of taxation in principles of microeconomics, but we're looking for a vertical gap between the import demand and export supply curve equal to T, or the amount of the tariff. So what we can do is we could do this algebraically if we wanted to get a firm number on this. But let's say this is the point, this is the quantity of exports and imports where the gap between the supplier's price and the consumer's price is exactly equal to the size of the tariff. And let's draw that on. It's a little bit below here. Maybe we should try a completely different color. I've got red already. How about, well, I think I'm going to have to go blue. Don't have many colors on this palette. Okay, so here you can see that at this point here, that's the supplier's price, and we move this up a bit, we see the consumer's price. And if we just stick with the world market right now, what we've got going on here is we have a vertical distance between export supply and import demand, such that the tariff is paid. We have some welfare loss triangles, and then we have this rather interesting area. Let's call this was PC, the price the consumer pays, and then this is PS, the price the supplier receives. And the first thing to say is that if this is the size of the tariff and this is the new lower level of imports and exports, so this is the amount of trade, let's call this Q, the amount traded with the tariff, then looking at the top half, if you can see this half, this little part here, this is the fraction of the tariff that is paid by the consumer in the import country in the form of increased price. So the price to the consumer goes up from PW to PC. They pay PC minus PW times the tariff to the government in the form of revenue. But then the interesting thing from the point of view of national welfare is this funny little area that I'm shading in red, and you can see this is the part of the tariff that is paid by the foreigner in the form of taking a lower price for the good from the import country overall. So that's actually got a special name, and so we've got, let's call it's PW minus PS gives you that distance on the vertical axis here, multiplied by QT is called the terms of trade effect. It's that part of the government revenue collected in a large country that is not paid by the consumers in the large country, but is instead forced back onto the suppliers of the good abroad. And so theoretically, a selfish country can use this to offset the welfare effects of the tariff. And as your book continues, and I won't do this here since I'm running out of space, but as your book shows, there is such a thing as the optimal tariff, which is a purely selfish concept, but it's the idea that you could take the terms of trade effect, that area of government revenue that comes from foreigners, minus, remember the welfare loss triangles, B plus D, subtract those, and what you're trying to do is you want to maximize, I should say that this maximizes that difference. So you're trying to maximize this is a positive gain to the country by extracting rent sort of from the foreign suppliers, and then you can compare that to actually B plus D together is this little triangle here. It's the top part of that triangle. And if terms of trade effect is bigger, you can say that the tariff was a net positive. If it's smaller, of course, then it's a negative. But theoretically, there will be a tariff that can actually make a country better off, provided they are a large country, and maybe you could even say provided they don't have terribly many scruples, perhaps. If we show this on a domestic diagram instead, if I put the two prices on, so move this down to here, and it looks a little funny on this diagram, I know, but what's going on here, of course, is that's PW, so this lower price is PS, happens to coincide, but that's just a coincidence, and then this top price here is PC. Consumers respond to PC. They don't care what's going on with the foreigner, so they respond to the tariff by cutting their spending on the good back from Q4 down to Q3, and so area D is this area here. This is area D as from before, and then because the price rose a little bit, the domestic industry responds just like it did in the small country case by increasing supply of the good. So this is This one here is B. But of course, as you can see, because PC doesn't rise by the full amount, then B and D, the inefficiencies associated with the tariff, are smaller. And then secondly, we can show on this diagram, we'll show that terms of trade effect, which we could see on the other diagram. It's the bottom portion of the government revenue rectangle that you have in the middle, and that makes sense, of course, because it's PW minus PS multiplied by the new lower level of import. So this thing here is the terms of trade effect. And incidentally, the terms of trade are kind of interesting, but the terms of trade are, if you only had one good exported and one imported, it would just be the ratio of export prices to import prices. If you're talking about the real world where you have lots of goods exported and imported, you would use an index of export prices divided by an index of import prices. So, you know, for example, let's say your export costs $50, whatever it is. You've only got one good, costs $50, and then your import, you only import one thing, it costs $10. Then the terms of trade would be $50 over $10, which is 5. And really what you're just saying is, if I export 1 unit of my export good, I can have 5 of the import goods, however defined. And so an improvement in the terms of trade is, say, when your export price goes up. So we say that a country's terms of trade have improved when the export price goes up relative to the import price. For example, if, say, this went up to $60, maybe you're an oil exporter and the price of oil goes up or something, then you would say, well, now in exchange for one of our export goods, maybe a barrel of oil, we can have 6 of the import goods. So now our terms of trade have improved. The effect on trade, of course, is ambiguous because quantities respond. So when the price of your exports go up, the foreigners may buy less of your exports. Whether you get more money depends on the elasticity of demand for your exports. But this is called an improvement in the terms of trade. Sometimes a lot of people speak favorably of what's called a deterioration in the terms of trade because, let's say, U.S. manufacturing industry is trying to sell abroad. If the terms of trade deteriorate or the exchange rate gets worse, then it gets complicated when you're talking about quantities. But this thing is called a terms of trade effect because essentially the net import price, net of the money we collect from foreigners in the form of tariff revenue, has gone down. So we call this is actually an improvement in the terms of trade. This is the size of the tariff revenue we can collect from foreigners. We can use it to offset those negative welfare effects of B and D, which are rather similar to the ones that you saw in the small country. And then, of course, in the small country, you can see the problem is, if you consider this a reasonable strategy, there is no terms of trade effect because you can't push any of the tariff on to the foreigner. And so that's how you distinguish a large country, a large import country imposing an import tariff compared to a small country imposing an import tariff.